A warm welcome to everyone. Hello, my name is Jenny Zhang, as Naomi mentioned, and I'm one of the Director of Studies in Chemistry for Corpus Christi College. I also lecture and research at the Department of Chemistry. And today we have a very exciting lineup uh, uh, of presentations for you. And the first masterclass has this very ambitious title of How Can Chemistry Solve the World's Biggest Problems and Questions. And so the aim of this masterclass, as well as the afternoon's masterclass, is to really just to give you an idea of what real life chemistry is about and real life research outside of what you might see in your textbooks and also maybe even on TV. So let's get started. Now, before you joined us, we asked you to ask us some big questions that you want us to answer. And you have responded overwhelmingly. It's been really wonderful to read through your questions. I really enjoyed it, and so did the rest of my panelists. So I've made a word cloud here, so you can see that you wanted to know how we can help in many different aspects of the world. So how can we help the climate? How do we reduce famine? Lots of very exciting questions. Now, disclaimer, we're not going to be able to answer all of the questions you ask, even though they're very great questions. We'll aim to get through as many as we can, and really my strategy is to pick out key questions and give you examples so you get a bit of everything. Okay, so I've regrouped the questions into categories. So you can see here, we've got some general questions, which I loved. So these are like you asking us back what the big questions that we're trying to answer are in one of the big questions. What kind of research that are we doing in the department and in the university? And then this question here, why is chemistry the best science? So this is one of our aims, is trying to convince you that yes, actually chemistry is the best science. Okay, and then you've also asked some other very specific questions. So those are the general questions. So you asked how chemistry can be used to improve living conditions, not just for ourselves, but for the whole 8 billion people in the world. How can chemistry be used to reverse climate change and environmental damage, to produce clean energy, to help medicine, to explain the origin of life, to create new materials and elements, and some questions on explaining how things work, which we will not address this red pit here, because really these form the foundations of some of your lectures in the future. So no need for us to explain here. But we will be going through each of these. So let's start with what are the current challenges? So you've given us your big questions. So what are the big questions that are asked by society? So I've now picked out an article that I read actually quite a while ago, about almost 10 years ago, from The Guardian, where it talked about the big questions in science. And I've just picked out the ones specific to chemistry. So it asks, how do we solve the population problem? Now, obviously, it's not just about the population has now plateaued somewhat. So it's all about solving how do we provide enough energy and food for the population now and for the future. Where do we put all the carbon? So this is to do with climate change. How do we get more energy from the sun? So this is to do with clean energy. How do we beat bacteria? So you can tell that this was written pre-COVID days, and I'm sure that if it was revised, it would be viruses will be added to the list. How can we cure cancer, and how did life begin? So you can see that the questions are very similar to the ones that you've been asking. And so the questions have not changed over the years, but the progress has. So let me just give you a very brief run through of some of the things that's been happening. Okay, starting with improving living conditions. So specifically under this category, you asked things like how do we make cleaner drinking water for everyone? Okay, how can we reduce famine and food shortages? What about sustainable farming? Things like that. These are fantastic questions. And let me start by addressing the water question, because that really links everything. Okay, so about 50% of the water that the world consumes comes from the ground, so groundwater. This is water that's beneath the soil sediments, and also 70% of farming water also comes from groundwater. Now, this is great for most regions, except for those that have heavy contamination. So here I've shown a example of the worst affected regions in Bangladesh. And you can see that up to 90% of the population in Bangladesh actually have to consume arsenic contaminated groundwater at some point. And the WHO has really pinpointed this as the most severe case of arsenic poisoning in the history of the world. And it's still it's still going on. And you can tell when someone is being affected by arsenic poisoning by just looking at things like lesions in their hand. These are very symptomatic. So arsenic is something that is naturally occurring in the ground, but also it can be released due to human activities such as mining, and pesticides, the use of pesticides on crop fields, or other types of agricultural plants. So let's have a look at the chemistry of arsenic to see why it's so harmful. Okay, so this is what arsenic looks like in its elemental form. It's a metalloid, but it's actually in group 15, which means it lies just underneath phosphorus. Now, we know that phosphorus is a very important part of the body, so it makes up a lot of ATP. So ATP, which is the energy carrier in our body, as well as in the backbone of our DNA. So arsenic has very similar properties to phosphate, and it actually mimics it in the body if we have it going around our body. And its most common form is when it's in water, is in arsenite and arsenate. Okay, so again, very similar in structure to phosphate and phosphite. And so when we have a lot of phosphate in our body, they can inactivate up to 200 different enzymes in our body that is related to energy, conversion, and metabolism, as well as DNA synthesis and repair. Uh, and so this is why it can cause cancers and various other types of diseases. And here are two very famous cases of arsenic poisoning. So Napoleon Bonaparte was found to have very high levels of arsenic in his body when he died, as well as Farlap, which is a famous racehorse that was killed suddenly, and it was due to arsenic poisoning. Okay, so luckily there is a solution. Okay, so for these regions, and actually it was a chemist who arrived at this solution. So let me introduce you to the chemist who published this paper. So Professor Abu Hussam, who was born in Bangladesh, and then he moved to the US to study chemistry, and he came up with this very elegant solution. He found that arsenic actually binds really tightly to some metal surfaces. So he was able to work with some engineers, and he came up with this very simple filtering system, which you can see in this photograph here. And it just basically consists of these composite iron matrix, so it's iron bearings, which can coordinate or bind very tightly to arsenic, removing them from the water, and then letting the water flow all the way through to the bottom, where then we can get clean water for consumption. Now, this is definitely a success story, and he won a very prestigious prize from from I think the Department of Engineering in the US, and it was over $1 million in prize money. So this is actually a very, very happy ending, except for the fact that even though we have a solution, the problem is not solved. The problem is actually now with the detection. Now, the WHO recommends that we do not consume do not consume water with arsenic levels of over 10 parts per billion, which is very, very dilute. Okay, and the state-of-the-art methods for detecting arsenic is actually, as you can expect, in a lab where we have lots of fancy equipment like, for example, mass spec or chromatography, where we can pick out these concentrations. Now, for farmers, people who are very far from labs, so farmers in Bangladesh, for example, this would be highly inaccessible. And so what they need is something else. And at the moment, this is probably the best that they've got. It's not that inexpensive, because £25 is actually a lot for farmers. And this is a testing kit that involves 3 different reagents. So you have something that acidifies your sample, and then you have to put a oxidizing agent with it, and then you put a reducing agent to eventually turn the arsenates into arsine, which is a gas, and then you react the gas with a strip of paper containing mercury bromide, and that produces a colored compound, which you match up to this. You can see this scale here to determine what concentration of arsenic you have. So you can see that this is quite finicky, and it's highly unlikely that a farm will be able to operate and use this properly. And so that's actually the current problem right now. Even though we have a very nice solution for treating arsenic in water, it's just people don't know when to use it. And especially in places where we need to use groundwater for farming, we need to decide, okay, do we use this plot of land or this plot of land? Do we consume rice grown from this field or this field? It's basically that's the main problem. We just don't know. We just don't have a very accessible way of knowing. And in fact, this is the main problem in many areas. Okay, we have very good solutions from chemistry, but we just don't know how to administer them properly and appropriately. So let me give you another example. Okay, so antibiotics, for example. Okay, so we have already found that penicillin can treat bacterial infections. However, because of the fact we don't know when someone is sick, if they're actually infected with a bacterial infection or virus, we prescribe the drugs, and now we have problems like antibiotic resistance. So if we have a sensing method in which we can detect whether an infection is bacterial or viral and then administer the treatment appropriately, this would solve a lot of this problem. And another example is in fertilizing, so in soil monitoring. So again, chemists have come up with the process Haber-Bosch process, and this has completely changed the way we feed the world in the last century. So we were able to feed, the billions of people in the world because of the Haber-Bosch process, and that allows us to take nitrogen from the air and turn it into fertilizer, into ammonia. Now, unfortunately, it's very difficult for farmers to know what is an appropriate amount to fertilize their ground, because sometimes it's very difficult to get the feedback. And if you over fertilize, it's as bad as unproductive as under fertilizing in terms of crop yields. But more than that, you get leaching. If you over fertilize, you get leaching into waterways, which contaminates the water. And then that causes things like algal blooms and dead zones, and also releases lots of greenhouse gas, nitrous oxides. And so overall, it's a terrible thing. And basically, we can solve a lot of this if we can produce better sensing platforms, chemical sensing platforms. So this is where chemists in the future and right now have to collaborate with engineers, with people who are in the fields, with lots of different people to produce these type of new technology. So this is something that we have to work on, and you as hopefully future chemists will have to work on as well. Okay, so let's move swiftly along to the next questions. So here we have another type of question where you're asking how can we use chemistry to reverse the effects of fossil fuels? And also other questions involve how do we minimize the impact of industrial chemical processes on climate change? Is it possible to trap carbon dioxide? Wonderful questions, wonderful questions. So let me begin by addressing the very first one. Can we reverse the effects of fossil fuels? Now, actually, yes, we can. But you're not going to like the answer, because it really involves us all turning into vegetarians. That might be fine for some people, but I doubt we can turn everyone into vegetarians. So you can see in this graph, this is the level of greenhouse gas emissions, okay, over years. And it's been predicted if we can revert back the land that we use for animal farming, okay, back to just forests or just something with a lot higher biodiversity, that would already help us to go backwards in terms of how much greenhouse gas we produce. And that is because 45% of the total land on Earth is currently being used for for animal agriculture. And that only feeds 20% of the population. So it's highly inefficient. And more than that, the livestock, they emit a lot of methane, which is a highly potent greenhouse gas. But luckily, that does break down. It has a half-life of 9 years. So if we can stop all of that, we can actually, reverse fossil fuel damages. Now, unfortunately, I think that's going to be a very difficult task, okay, because people just love their meat too much. Now, a chemist or a biochemist solution is, well, why not then make some fake meat, or not fake meat, but plant-based meat? Okay, so this was a innovation that's pioneered by Pat Brown, and he made what is called these impossible meats, okay, where if you bite into it, it actually tastes and feels and look like real meat. Okay, actually, I've tasted this, and this is highly, very, very popular in the US. Okay, even Burger King has adopted it into their Whoppers, and I definitely think it tastes better than real meat. And the secret here is that what is making this meat pink in the middle, okay, it is the thing that makes meat meat. It's the heme inside of the burgers that gives it the iron, the red taste. Okay, and what he has found is that actually some plants in the root systems, they really need to balance out and regulate oxygen concentrations very carefully. And to do that, they need another type of hemoglobin-like protein. And so basically, we can take this from plants and extract the heme from it, and also the protein from it. And you can see here, it looks very much like blood. And he can incorporate that into the plant-based meat so that it tastes and feel very much like real meat. So that's one of the solutions. And in the future and in the present, we can basically look forward to maybe some other types of plant-based meat, which will look and feel like meat. And maybe we can go back and reverse climate change in this way. Now, obviously, we need lots of other different types of techniques because we can't just rely on one type of solution. Okay, so can we also remove CO2 from the air directly? Well, actually, we have a very effective device that we have all around us called plants. They can absorb CO2 4 times faster than we release CO2 gas into the air. The problem, well, not really the problem. The issue is that actually they interact in a cycle. Okay, so plants, they absorb very efficiently CO2 from the air, but then they respire about 50% of it back into the air, and then the rest is fixed into the leaves and the petals and the branches, the biomass, and it's retained there until it dies, and then it starts to degrade. And when it degrades and decomposes, it releases the CO2 back in the air. So it completes a cycle. So what chemists have been trying to do is to interrupt this cycle. So can we perhaps take the biomass just when it has died, and then treat it using a process called pyrolysis, where it basically burn it in the absence of oxygen to turn it into a very reduced form of carbon, and they call this biochar. And then we can use this material in a number of ways. And the most significant, I'm going to talk about this, is the use of these biochar in soil supplements. Because if you look at biochar, they're highly porous. Okay, they retain the former structures of the plants, which means that they can retain moisture and nutrients much better, and then they stay stable if they're made well for centuries, if not millennia. So this is a really good way of us to store CO2, turn it into a product that we can use. We can use it to treat soil and use it kind of like a fertilizer, as you can see here, because it's just very good for retaining nutrients and moisture in very dry places. It can be used in agriculture, and at the same time, we're storing CO2. So this is a very innovative new way of capturing CO2. But what about capturing CO2 directly? That would also be very efficient. And in fact, we have someone in the panel who can tell you more about that. Alex, would you like to tell us what you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely, Jenny. So just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Alex Force, and I'm a lecturer and researcher in the chemistry department here. And my research overall is sort of focused around climate change mitigation. And as Jenny sort of touched on this, there's lots of different things that we need to be doing in parallel, not only sort of behavioral changes as a society, but also technological advances where chemistry can help us mitigate climate change. So as Jenny asked, can we capture CO2 from factories? Well, actually, this is a very good idea, because these point sources of emissions, like factories, are places where CO2 is very highly concentrated. So you can imagine if something's very highly concentrated, it's easier to collect that and mitigate it. So in many factories, for example, cement factories and steel factories, and also currently fossil fuel power stations, we're emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, the idea with CO2 capture, this technology, is to capture the greenhouse gas, which is the CO2, and let the other gases go out the chimney, and then take that CO2 that you've captured and store it in the ground. And if you can do that, then you can mitigate its global warming effect. And you might ask, is this a safe thing to do? Well, geologists are looking at this, and they've shown that yes, if you put CO2 in the correct types of rock formations, it's permanently sequestered. So this is actually technology that we already have now on quite a large scale, but it's still very early days, I would say. So this is a pilot demonstration of a CO2 capture process in Texas in the US. And what they've done here is they put these very large columns of amine molecules, and they put these on this sort of the back end of a coal-fired power station. And what they showed is that they could capture about 1 million tons of CO2 per year for 3 years. So that's a large amount of CO2, and that can make a significant dent in emissions, especially if we scale this up. So how does this work? Actually, the chemistry is probably sort of familiar with you, familiar to most of you. So amines are effectively nucleophiles. So the nitrogen atoms are electron rich, whereas carbon dioxide, the carbon is electrophilic. So it's effectively positive and it can react with a negative amine. So in those huge columns that I just showed you, what you have is an amine solution in water. And then when you flow through the mixture of gases, only the CO2, the greenhouse gas, reacts with the amine in a nucleophile electrophile reaction here. And I'll leave you to go through this sort of mechanism of this later, but you need a second amine molecule because the hydrogen gets transferred across to make a charge balancing ammonium species here. Okay, so then the other gases are just going to flow on out of the chimney. We've captured the CO2. Okay, so we'd rather not bury this in the ground now because we're going to need a lot of amine molecules. So what we do with carbon capture is regenerate the material. And so in a second step, what we do is heat up the amine solution, and that drives the release of CO2, which we can then collect and then store in the ground, or potentially also make useful products out of it. So we have this technology today, and it's really just a matter of sort of scaling this up. But the technology does have some limitations. So there's issues with these amines sort of degrading over time, and that's a problem that chemists are trying to solve by making new amines. There's also issues with evaporation of these amines into the atmosphere, which have their own sort of environmental issues associated with them. And there's also a lot of energy that has to go into doing this regeneration of the amine for CO2 collection. So one of the things we're working on in my lab is trying to find new materials that can do carbon capture processes in a more efficient way and overcome some of these problems. And so one of the questions as well from you was about metal organic framework materials. So I thought I'd just briefly introduce those. So these are a class of materials that we're working on in our laboratory. And you can almost think of these materials as like sort of Lego-based materials where you have different building blocks that you put together to make a porous structure. And so what you have is these metal ions. In this case, it's a zinc ion, and these are shown in blue here. And they're linked together by these organic building blocks. In this case, it's this so-called DOB-DC molecule. You can figure out what that stands for later, but it's quite a mouthful. But these come together to give a porous structure. And then these channels can then let CO2 come in inside, and CO2 can actually be absorbed, for example, on these metal sites. And so these materials actually in the lab are looking very promising for CO2 capture. And they overcome a lot of the issues with amines. But this is very early days, and what we're working on now, and what other people are working on, in particular engineers, is scaling these materials up and testing them for practical CO2 capture processes. So there's lots more research to be done in this area. I'll hand it back to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Alex. For those of you who do not know Alex, he's a new lecturer at the Department of Chemistry in Cambridge as well. Alex, do you mind just stop sharing? There we go. And I'll start sharing again. Here we go. Okay, thank you, Alex. That was really interesting and also really exciting to see the new technologies that's being developed. So let's move swiftly ahead. We just answered that question. Let's see if I can change slides. There we go. Okay, so related to that, we can't just think about capturing carbon. We also have to think about replacing the fossil fuels that we have. So now we're on to the question of clean energy. How can chemistry help us to solve the world's sustainable energy crisis? How can we create better batteries? How can we make better fuels and beat photosynthesis? These are excellent questions that are coming from you. So let's start by examining, first of all, before we go into that, how we use energy in the first place. So this was a survey that was done a few years ago, but basically what they've learnt is that about 18% of our energy use is actually in the form of electricity, and a vast majority is in fuels. Now, hopefully this is changing because of the popularity with electric cars and so on. And that's fantastic because we can get already renewable electricity in the form of, from solar fuels and from hydro, from thermo, and these are great. Now, one of the problems though with electricity is the storage, and some of you have already pointed out we need better batteries that are more environmentally friendly, and maybe even just higher performing. Luckily, Alex also does research in this area. So, Alex, would you like to tell us about what you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I'd just like to pick up on the points that you were making about the importance of energy storage, Jenny. And yeah, I see sort of two key areas where this is really important. So, with increasingly renewable energy on the electricity grid, that brings a challenge of the sort of intermittency of these energy sources. So, when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, we may not have energy. So we need a stored reserve to then supply energy to the grid. So that's one really important area where we need batteries, but also for distributed energy. So for having energy, wherever you are, we all have it in our pockets. We have batteries in our mobile phones. In a few years' time, sort of petrol-powered cars are going to be banned in the UK, and we'll be moving to an all-electric vehicle fleet. So this is just to underscore the importance of batteries. And I'm afraid there's a few technical issues with this slide, but this is basically the state-of-the-art battery that you've got probably in your pocket right now if you've got a mobile phone on you. And this battery is comprised of graphite on one side, and then the other electrode material is, in this case, lithium cobalt oxide. And what happens is when you're discharging the battery, lithium ions move from the graphite side, and they go across and intercalate into the layers of lithium cobalt oxide on the other side here. And then when you want to recharge the battery and you plug it back in, so when you do this tonight, lithium ions are then actually sort of moving from the lithium cobalt oxide side back to the graphite side. And so it's this sort of back and forth movement of lithium. But yeah, one of the key questions though was, what about batteries, and are they sustainable? Are they environmentally friendly? It's a really good question. I really like this periodic table here, which you can find online. So it's the periodic table where the different elements have been sort of scaled by their relative abundance on Earth. I think in the Earth's crust, so sort of the accessible elements. And what you can see, if you think about this state-of-the-art lithium battery with lithium cobalt oxide, we're relying heavily on lithium and cobalt as major components of the battery, and these are very scarce elements on Earth. And this is actually already, creating issues with this scale up of electric vehicles. So what can we do? Well, I think in the first instance, we obviously need battery recycling, and that's actually another area where chemists are actively working to make new methods for recycling batteries. But also fundamentally, we need new battery technology that gets away from these elements. And there's so much work going on here in the field, and I'll just give you a few highlights. But looking at this periodic table, it kind of gives you a bit of a roadmap of where to go here. Ideally, we would go towards organic materials, actually, like carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen-based materials. So I'll talk about that in a moment. Other things that people are doing to sort of tackle the scarcity of lithium, to look at things like sodium. Okay, yeah, we can just go one down the periodic table as a classic trick for chemists. We should expect kind of similar performance, okay? But actually, it's very challenging because sodium is larger than lithium, and so this kind of intercalation into graphite or transition metal oxides, it doesn't work so well. So that's another challenge that chemists are working to overcome. So just to give you one example of an alternative battery technology, this is a so-called flow battery, and this is a very promising technology for storing energy on the electricity grid. And the way this works is you have two reservoirs. So you can imagine having a big tank. You have two different tanks here, and they're each filled with a different molecule. And these aren't just any molecules, they're redox active molecules. So that means they have different oxidation states that are readily accessible. And what's really exciting about these batteries is that you can use these very low cost and sustainable materials. So you can use, for example, these carbon and oxygen hydrogen-based materials called quinones, which are naturally occurring. So some of these quinones, for example, you can get in plants and plant roots. And then on the other side of this battery, in this case, we've got an iron containing molecule now. And we showed before, iron is also very naturally abundant in the Earth's crust. So these are potentially much more sustainable, and there'll be less environmental issues with mining of these materials. And just to briefly tell you how this battery works, what you do is when you're charging it, you pump molecules from the tanks through effectively the battery part where you can charge them up. So this quinone molecule can accept 2 electrons and become this negatively charged molecule, whereas at the same time, the iron 2 is going to be oxidized to iron 3. So that charges up the battery, you store those molecules in the tanks, and then later when you need energy, the sun stops shining or the wind stops blowing, you can then flow these back the other way and get energy out. And then perhaps just briefly, I'll tell you about one other technology here, which Jenny just very briefly alluded to earlier when she was talking about biochar. And that's these supercapacitor energy storage devices. So here you can take another organic material, so coconut shells. You can actually treat them chemically, heat them up in inert gas, and you get a carbon material. And then you can make electrodes from that. And these carbon electrodes are very interesting because in just sort of 1 gram of material that you can hold in your hand, you have thousands of meters squared of surface area in the material. You have a lot of these pores in the material that you can then use for energy storage. And so what you can do is take 2 of these electrodes and put them together and put an electrolyte in between. So this could be, for example, something cheap like salt water, so sodium chloride in water. And then when you apply a potential between these, you can store charge by inserting ions into the electrodes. And this is a process that can happen very rapidly. So these can be charged more quickly than batteries. And they also have a very long lifetime. So you can get millions of cycles out of these, unlike batteries where you're limited to more sort of 1,000, 2,000 cycles before you need to buy a new one. So yeah, this is another promising technology, but supercapacitors are not without limitations as well, and they don't store as much energy as batteries. So one of the things we're working on in the lab is to sort of bump up supercapacitor energy storage to match that of batteries. Okay, but yeah, there's lots more work to be done in this field, and hopefully some of you will enter the field of chemistry and make important contributions in these areas. So I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Alex. Can I just, before you leave, could you tell us what makes chemistry the best subject for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think besides all of the really important sort of technological applications of chemistry, which I think give me a lot of motivation, what really actually excites me, to be honest, is doing experiments in the lab and sort of seeing, when we're doing research, we see a lot of new phenomena where you see something new, you don't know what it is, and that's just really exciting because then you're seeing things for the first time that nobody's ever seen. And eventually, with sort of normally years of work, we can uncover new chemistry. So that's why chemistry is the best subject for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. Now, Alex will be around maybe for 2 to 5 more minutes. And if you have any quick questions for him, just drop them in the Q&A and he'll try and answer them if he can. In the meantime, I'm just going to speed along. Okay, so we just talked about better batteries, but let's go back then to addressing the other side of energy use. So we need fuels as well, because fuels are very different from electricity and batteries, mainly because they're they're another type of energy storage, but they're extremely energy dense. They can store 100 times more energy than batteries, the lithium battery can. And so we need them to power specific things like rockets to space, and also they're a very important chemical for starting reagents for other types of products. So how do we make fuels? Well, first of all, where should we get the energy from? And I think it's no surprise to anyone that the most renewable source of energy we have on Earth is actually the sun. So if you look at this bright yellow circle here, this represents how much energy hits the Earth's surface in a year. And this little dot here is how much energy we actually consume in a year. And it's very, very, very little. So we should definitely make more use of the sun. Now, nature has already figured this out, and nature has its own mechanism. It's called photosynthesis. It's a very important process, and it's basically the main way in which solar energy is channeled into the biosphere. And this is what has been fueling life on Earth as we know it. And it's also where our fossil fuels originally got their energy from. And photosynthesis is depicted in textbooks like this. So it's water combining with carbon dioxide in the presence of sunlight. It turns into carbohydrate and oxygen. But if you zoom in into a leaf to see how it actually works, this is something, it's a very simplified schematic of what it looks like. What it consists of is a series of proteins and enzymes. So starting with Photosystem Ii, its role is to absorb sunlight, use that energy to break apart water to extract the electrons, and the electrons are then passed along this chain here. Eventually it is shuttled somewhere where it can be used to reform a different bond, usually making something more complicated or just a brand new chemical in the first place. So this is nature's way of storing solar energy into chemical energy to make fuels. Chemists have been trying to replicate this, and not just replicate it but beat it for centuries. Like this is basically the holy grail for the last century, where we want to mimic photosynthesis using chemistry, and basically produce renewable fuels. Now, to do this, we need three separate components. So first of all, I've already talked about we need something that can absorb light. We need the electrons that are excited to be separated and transferred away. And thirdly, very importantly, we need catalysts so that we can do the reduction and the oxidation reactions, so that we can take electrons from one thing and then give it to another chemical to remake bonds. Now, we are already very good at beating photosynthesis when it comes to light absorption. We have plenty of dyes and materials that can absorb light better than nature can. What we're not so good at the moment is actually at the catalysis. So just to give you a very simple analogy of what a catalyst is, if we think of our substrate, so in this case, a water, as a can, if we want to break it open and I give it to you and I give you a can and say, can you please open it for me? You probably give it your best shot, but you won't be able to open it. You probably dent it a little bit. Now, if I give you a catalyst, so like a can opener in this case, you'll be able to open it with minimal effort, and would be able to extract all its contents very easily. Now, nature has a lot of can openers or a lot of catalysts already for fuel formation. So here are some examples. So we talked about water oxidation, okay, and then we can also make other types of chemicals or fuels. So in this case, hydrogen gas. And then we also have, if you want to make more complicated substances, we can use a series, a cascade of enzymes to make more complicated chemicals. And these are really elegant catalysts because they have these protein scaffolds are able to channel or funnel in specific substrates so that you have very great selectivity. And also at the active site, where the chemical rearrangement actually occurs, the protein structure is able to help hold on to the substrate in a certain way to stabilize the intermediate states so that you can facilitate the end result, which is the production of a certain product. Now, chemists can make catalysts as well, and these are some of the state-of-the-art catalysts. So here for water oxidation, for proton reduction, for CO2 reduction, and they can come in the form of molecules, of just materials and composites. But you can kind of think of them in our analogy as like machetes. That is, they work pretty okay, but you probably need to put in a lot of effort. Okay, they're not so efficient and they're not so selective either. So compared to what nature has, they're good, but they do the job, but they're probably less elegant. And what's more, you can see, going back to Alex's periodic table of abundance, they're made from very earth-scarce materials. And so this is a challenge that we are facing right now. We would need to make better catalysts. Ideally, it would be great if we could use the enzymes themselves because they're very earth abundant. They derive from all trace materials from the earth, but they're very fragile when you isolate them and use them as catalysts. So very hot area of research in this area is basically making better synthetic catalysts, but also people are now looking at using the enzymes once it's inside of living organisms, so living catalysts. So for some examples include cyanobacteria. These are excellent for doing oxidation reactions. Okay, we have other types of really amazing bacteria like Geobacter. You can shoot electrons through their pili, which are very conductive, and then the electrons can be taken in and they can be used to do all sorts of reduction reactions like CO2 reduction. And then we can also make biohybrids where we take the best of both worlds. We take a cyanobacteria, we take a bacteria that's not photosynthetic and we photosensitize it with an artificial light absorber because we know that we can make very excellent photosensitizers these days. And then we can do light-driven fuel formation in this way. And the best thing about these living organisms is that they're self-repairing so that they can be very robust and they're very abundant as well. So this is a very exciting area of research that's being explored. And my lab in particular is looking at cyanobacteria. Okay, so hopefully that's just a nice glimpse of what's being done in the renewable energy sector. Now, we cannot go past and finish this lecture without telling you about what chemistry is being contributing towards the current COVID crisis, because you asked a lot of medicinal questions. And for this question, we have Claudia. Would you like to share with us? Oh, actually, I am going to give you the slides for that.
Okay. So hi everyone. Just to introduce myself, my name is Claudia, and I am a 1851 research fellow, which means basically in fancy words that I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Chemistry, and I'm also one of the director of studies for chemistry at Corpus. So I guess I'm going to split the question in how can chemistry help with the coronavirus crisis and how can chemists help in the coronavirus crisis. So starting from chemistry, we know quite a lot about the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We know that in simple terms that a virus is made of genetic material. For example, it could be RNA or DNA, in this case it's RNA. And this RNA, this genetic material is encapsulated, is contained inside a bubble that is made of lipids, which are molecules that have a similar structure to the molecules that form your oil or that form something else that we use every day, which is soap. And we know that one of the best weapons we have to fight coronavirus is soap. So if we go to the next slide, this is what soap would look like if you look at that, let's say at the microscope or even more. So soap is made of molecules which have this kind of weird shape. So they have what's represented here as a sphere, which is a part of the molecule that likes water. And that's why it's in the external part of what is so-called micelle. And they have this zigzag part of the molecule, which is hydrophobic, so it doesn't like water, and that's why it's not exposed to water. And so what happens here is that these kind of molecules are very similar in shape and structure to the molecules that form the lipid membranes that you can see on the left part of the screen and that contain the genetic material of the virus. So the best weapon we have to fight the coronavirus, for example, if we have it on our hands or if we want to clean surfaces in our home, is to use soap. And the way it works, if we go to the next slide, the way it works is that we've always known and we've always studied in chemistry that similar things dissolve similar things. And so if you want to be able to fight coronavirus by by challenging the lipid membrane that contains our nucleic acid, the viral nucleic acid and lipid and genetic material. What you can do is use soap, which will dissolve the lipid membrane and break it apart. And this is a nice infographic that I got from from an article of the Australian Academy of Science. So of course, if we go to the next slide, we've learned and we've heard a lot that we can also use alcohol-containing sanitizers. What's important to know here is that alcohol works in a very similar way, because alcohol can dissolve lipids and so can dissolve the lipid membranes, but you need to have quite an important amount, quite a high amount of alcohol. So you need to have at least 60, even more percent of alcohol in your sanitizers in order to be effective, which means that if you just want to use, wine or vodka, that's not enough because it doesn't contain enough alcohol. And now we can move to the next question, which is how can chemists fight the coronavirus crisis? So this is a nice infographic that I got from the Protein Data Bank of the RNA polymerase of the virus. And this is an enzyme, one of those can openers that Jenny was referring to. This is an enzyme that is used to replicate the viral RNA, and that the virus uses to replicate the viral RNA. And the way it works is that it takes all these red dots that you can see in the right top corner of the screen. And these are all nucleotides, which are the monomers, so the small building blocks that form an RNA structure. And this enzyme is capable of joining them together. So if we move to the next slide, we can see what these red dots are. And this is just an example of one of the nucleotides that make the RNA of both virus, but also in our cells. And this is just to show you one of the basic structures of the nucleotides that are used by this enzyme to build the viral RNA. And if we look at the next slide, this is what you can see we can do as chemists. So what we can do if we want to fight this enzyme and preventing it from going on and reproducing the viral RNA is to feed them with something that looks like the building blocks of RNA, but it's not exactly the building block of RNA. So this is Rendezvir. It's an antiviral that was designed and produced by a Californian biopharmaceutical company. And you've probably heard of this a lot. This is an RNA polymerase inhibitor. And you can see, if you look at the two structures on the right and on the left, that they have quite a similar shape. So you can see there's in the middle, there's the sugar backbone. And then you have on the top right, you have the nitrogen base part. And you can see that this is basically the same. And then you have on the left, you have a phosphorus containing group. Now the phosphorus containing group is needed to make this molecule recognizable by the RNA polymerase so that it can be used instead of the normal nucleotides. And then you can see that there's one very, very small, tiny difference between these two molecules, which is that cyano group that is on the ribose, so on the sugar part of the nucleotide. And that's actually what makes the RNA that then is formed very weird in structure so that it does not continue to be replicated. And that's how chemists can fight and help fighting the coronavirus crisis.
Thank you, Claudia. That's really interesting. And you get to hear more from Claudia this afternoon when she explains to you her research on using chemistry to explain the origin of life. Okay, so in the interest of time, we'll move on straight to the very last question we're going to address for this lecture. So many of you actually asked this question: what would be the predicted properties of elements with atomic numbers past 118? Now, this is an excellent question, and one in which I can find someone even better to answer than myself. So I would like to introduce to you my colleague that I interviewed earlier this week, Professor Professor Peter Wothers. So let me just share what he has to say on this particular question.
My name is Peter Wothers. I'm a fellow across the road from Jenny at St Catherine's College. Well, one of our honorary fellows at St Catherine's College is actually Yuri Oganessian, and he has the distinction of being the only man alive that has an element named after him. And this is the last element in the periodic table, element 118, Oganesson. Well, scientists in Russia, Japan, and Germany are all trying to synthesize the next elements. And it is pretty clear that elements 119 and 120 will be in the S block underneath francium and radium. But what's less clear is exactly what happens after that. Now, you might think that there should be a G block with the next electron going into the 5G orbital, but it's not so simple. In fact, the nice regular structure of the periodic table might fall apart from this point. So let me explain. We're used to the idea that as we go across from left to right, across a period in the periodic table, we add one more electron and one more proton. The order in which the subshells fill up has dictated the form of the table that we currently use. We're used to the fact that after the 3p shell of argon is filled, the next electron goes into the 4s shell in potassium and calcium. Only after that is the 3d subshell filled. But this means that in our usual form of the periodic table, we put the D block in between the S and the P blocks, so that as we move from one element to the next one along the right, calcium with its filled 4s subshell, we go to scandium, where the electron goes into the 3d subshell. Now, the problem with the next elements that will be discovered is that when we add one more proton and electron to element 120, which is a filled 8s subshell, into what electronic shell does the next electron go? It would be nice if it simply went into the 5G subshell and started a new block, the G block. However, theory predicts that it might actually end up in the 8p subshell, and therefore the periodic table would have a massive gap between element 120 in group 2 and element 121 in group 13. And it's because the subshells, the 5G, 6f, 8s, 8p, and even the 9s and 9p become so similar in energy that the next electrons to add into the periodic table could go into almost any one of those. And that means that the regular structure of the table might just fall apart.
Wow, thank you very much, Peter, for answering our big question. I wonder whether I can follow up with a nice little question about why you think chemistry is the best subject.
Well, I think that's pretty easy for me. I mean, I've had a love of the subject since I was probably about 8 years old and had my first chemistry set. I think what I really love about the subject is how it really gives us a tangible way of understanding the world around us. In terms of, you know, if I'm looking at my desk, I can understand the material that it's made of. I can understand the sort of the paints that I see on the wall, the medicines that I take. I mean, this is how we interact with our world at a molecular level. I mean, you could argue that it's all about electrons, protons, and neutrons, actually, but I mean, yeah, that's not quite how we actually sort of usually come across the world. So that's how I think, why I think chemistry is the best subject.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your help. For those of you who do not know Peter, he is a lecturer at our department, so he does the first year lecturings, but he's also well known for his BBC Christmas special called The Modern Alchemist. For those of you who haven't seen it, I really recommend that you do check it out. It's online. He does a lot of spectacular experiments there, like lots of explosives. And I think one of the questions was, how can you light a diamond on fire? Yes, you can. Just check it out on his Christmas special. Okay, so that concludes our first lecture.